I want to start by saying that I am delighted to be here and to give my thanks to all of you for making the time to come, and to give special thanks to Dr. Amin and Dr. Khalil for inviting me to this space. The title of my talk is "The Prophet Was an Entrepreneur," in quotation marks, Unearthing Islamic Theologies of the Right. And this is a paper I've been researching for several months, and I have loads of material and data, but as we only have about 17 minutes each, I'm going to focus on three things. First of all, the significance of the topic and the intervention that it tries to make. Secondly, historical memory and how the Prophet has been constructed. And finally, how that construction lines up with the Sirah, the classical biographical sources. So let's start with the significance and intervention. As Dr. Narima noted, this paper is actually part of a larger monograph project on Islam and the left. Now, as a non-American, I'm mindful this conference is being hosted at a US university, so I want to clarify that by the left, I don't mean the Democratic Party, i.e., I don't view the left as a negative signifier, as a catch-all umbrella term for anyone who is not uber right. Rather, I define the left as a cluster of radical political movements that have been shaped by Marxism, most notably socialism and communism. Centered on social equality, the left views capitalism as an inherently exploitative system, calling for structural transformation in the social relations between capitalists and workers as a critical prerequisite for justice. So in this monograph, I'm interested in the relationship not between Islam and liberalism, but between Islam and the radical left, the revolutionary left. And there are different ways that you can engage the topic. One way is constructionist, exploring how Muslims have creatively articulated an Islamic left, al-Yasar al-Islami. And there are several thinkers who come to mind. The Syrian scholar Mustafa Sibai in the 1960s, the Egyptian philosopher Hassan Hanafi, who recently passed away in 2021, Allah yarhamu, and the Turkish mufassir and trade unionist Ihsan Eliachik. And in terms of living exponents of the Islamic left, Eliachik is probably the most well-known example today. In this paper, I argue that tackling the complex relationship between Islam and the left requires a dual hermeneutical approach. Creative construction, as reflected in the aforementioned thinkers, but also critical deconstruction. That is, robbing mainstream Islam of its innocence. Robbing mainstream Islam of its innocence. Let me explain what I mean by this. When I go around and talk about Islamic liberation theology, I'm often criticized as politicizing Islam, as instrumentalizing Islam. But politics is everywhere. There is no such thing as an apolitical Islam or a pristine, ideology-free Islam. And this is due to the very basic fact that any religious tradition, or for that matter, any idea or social practice, cannot exist outside the realm of power relations. As the political scientist Peter Mandeville observes, the claim to be apolitical or non-political is precisely that, a claim, and a claim that reflects a particular type of establishment politics. Critical deconstruction, therefore, is about unearthing the ways in which Muslim subjects have internalized capitalist and neoliberal logics. And because these logics, these ways of thinking and ways of being are increasingly normalized, they have effectively become invisible, natural, hegemonic. This is an Islam that is rarely called out and named as a quote-unquote right-wing Islam or a quote-unquote neoliberal Islam. Increasingly, this is an Islam that has the privilege to neutrally and universally posture as just Islam. In terms of primary sources, in this paper I focus on popular online content, including articles, websites, and especially YouTube videos, both long and short form. This online content is produced by freelance writers, well-known shuyukh like Hamza Yusuf Hansen in the US and Mufti Ismail Menk in Zanzibar, and organizations like Ummahpreneur in Canada, Takedia in Nigeria, Islamic Finance Group IFG in the UK, Global Muslim Entrepreneurs, and Ummah International, which is a global business network based in Indonesia. This brings us to historical memory and constructions of the Prophet. These content creators are not just entrepreneurs. They identify as Muslim entrepreneurs. That is to say, they normatively position themselves in relation to the Sunnah, the custom of the Holy Prophet, representing him as a talented and successful businessman, especially before he received revelation at the age of 40. Being born in Mecca meant that the Prophet was enmeshed in the world of a commercial center. To quote Ummah International, quote, "As a teenager, he began working in Mecca's bustling trade routes. By his 20s, he was managing investment portfolios, specifically the trade caravans of Lady Khadija bint Khuwaylid," end quote. Indeed, the usage of 21st century corporate grammar, like investment, portfolio, risk, and market, is ubiquitous in the online material. Ummah International goes on to describe the Prophet's talent at managing risk and negotiating tricky market dynamics, traveling all over Arabia for trade. Khadija, in turn, is described as, quote, "the first investor in Islam." In a YouTube short by Ummahpreneur in Canada, Khadija is celebrated as, quote, "the first female entrepreneur in Islam." I have a bit more to say about Khadija later in the paper. But the Prophet isn't just portrayed as a businessman, he was a gifted businessman. This wasn't just a daily job for him, the man was born to trade. All of the sources emphasize that when leading Khadija's caravan to Syria, the Prophet easily turned out a sizable profit. To quote Hamza Yusuf, "Khadija had never had anybody that transacted with her money like the Messenger of Allah, and should we be surprised?" End quote. The Prophet's entrepreneurial skill, alongside his reputation as as-Sadiq, the truthful, and al-Amin, the trustworthy, made a lasting impression on Khadija. On his return to Mecca, she proposed to him and they got married. To clarify, the Prophet is consistently portrayed as a businessman who had strong ethical boundaries. His honesty and integrity allowed him to strike a healthy balance between trade and wealth creation on the one hand, and ethical conduct and community service on the other. This is what made Muhammad stand out from the corruption and exploitation that plagued Meccan commerce. In the words of Takedia, a business education institute based in Nigeria, the Prophet was the ultimate, quote, "social entrepreneur," addressing the community needs while also and always generating profit. Now we get to a really interesting bit. In the online material, this representation of the Prophet as entrepreneur comes packaged with the sanctification, the elevation of trade and business as a sacred vocation. Here's a passage from Ummah International in Indonesia. Quote, "When Allah chose to prepare a leader who would guide not just a tribe or a region, but all of humanity, he didn't send him to a palace. He didn't raise him in a scholar's seminary, and he didn't place him in the barracks of a military camp. He sent him to the marketplace. Prophet Muhammad was trained in the school of trade. He was shaped not in isolation, but in the tension and transaction of business. And among all professions, farmer, scribe, warrior, poet, Allah chose a merchant as the early mold for the most successful human being in history. This is no accident, it is divine design," end quote. So there is something about being a businessman that is special and unique, enabling a future prophet to cut his teeth in social relationships, practical negotiations, and leadership experience. This passage not only singles out trade over other professions, but by extension sacralizes the physical space, the physicality of the market over other spaces: the farm, the palace, the seminary, and the military barrack. Hamza Yusuf takes it a step further. Reflecting on why Allah would choose a merchant as the final prophet, Yusuf arrives at the following conclusion, quote, "The reason that the prophet was chosen to be a merchant was because the merchant is the most beneficial human being in human society. There is no one more beneficial to society than a merchant. Everything, the chairs that you are sitting on are from commerce. The clothes you are wearing are from commerce. The medication that is keeping your blood pressure low right now is from commerce. Everything that is beneficial to the material well-being of the human being is from commerce." End quote. There's so much to unpack right there, but due to time constraints, I want to pivot to the Sirah to explore how the online content lines up with the pre-modern texts. These texts include the biographical works of Muhammad ibn Ishaq in the 8th century, Muhammad ibn Sa'ad in the 9th century, Abu Ja'far al-Tabari in the 10th century, and Ismail ibn Kathir in the 14th century. In these texts, there is no mention of Muhammad undertaking extensive business travels across Arabia and Yemen. Rather, they briefly describe 2 trade journeys the Prophet made, both to Syria. And the first trade journey tells us nothing about the Prophet's skills as a merchant, and how could it possibly do so? He was only a 9-year-old child at the time. His uncle and guardian Abu Talib felt bad about leaving him alone in Mecca, and so told Muhammad to come along. Indeed, the first journey narrative has little interest in commerce at all. Rather, its literary objective as a narrative is to prove that this child was destined to become a prophet. Ibn Ishaq describes how the Christian monk Bahira saw a cloud following Abu Talib's caravan, with the cloud stopping whenever the caravan stopped. On inspecting a birthmark between Muhammad's shoulders, Bahira confirmed that Muhammad was the promised messenger. This imagery of clouds following and shading and protecting the Prophet can also be found in the narratives of Ibn Kathir and At-Tabari, with At-Tabari adding another dimension with this statement from Bahira. So this is Bahira addressing the Prophet and the caravan. Quote, "I know that when you appeared at the top of the pass, there was not a tree or a stone which did not prostrate itself in worship, and they only prostrate themselves to a prophet." End quote. The second trade narrative takes place many, many years later. The Prophet is now a man of 25 and has been commissioned by Khadija to take her caravan to Syria, accompanied by her servant Maysara. And here the online content creators have a point. The Prophet did return with a sizable profit, but there are important nuances in the Sirah literature. Firstly, and this is well known, Muhammad was a contracted employee of Khadija. An entrepreneur starts a business, is their own boss, and even employs others. Muhammad wasn't even a partner, let alone his own boss. He worked for someone else. Moreover, Maysara's presence in the entire narrative is curious and potentially significant. If Khadija had full confidence in Muhammad's business skills, not his honest reputation, that was undisputed, but in his actual trade acumen, why would she dispatch one of her own employees to basically supervise him and monitor the whole situation? My guess is that she took an informed chance. In a wider Arabian context marred with corruption, she was willing to privilege Muhammad's honesty over his actual business experience. But she was too experienced herself to leave this amateur unsupervised. And this brings us to the second point. In the Sirah sources, if there is a shrewd business person, it is not Muhammad, it is Khadija. And that should hardly be surprising given her extensive wealth and assets. In his biographical dictionary of early Muslim women, Ibn Sa'd describes Khadija's caravan as, quote, equal to the general caravan of the Quraysh, end quote. Furthermore, Ibn Ishaq mentions that Khadija did not just pay her employees a set wage, but engaged in a practice of profit sharing called mudaraba, thereby giving them a personal stake in the success of the trade. She used the same strategy with the Prophet, and Ibn Sa'd writes that she promised the Prophet double the wage if, and only if, he traded her goods well. And this brings me to the last point. This second trade journey needs to be read as an extension of the first trade journey, back when Muhammad was a child. What I mean by this is that the hermeneutical function of both narratives is one and the same, to prove Muhammad's divine election as prophet. Ibn Ishaq, At-Tabari, and Ibn Kathir all mention that various signs and miracles took place during the second trade journey, one on the way to Syria and one on the return trip to Mecca. The event on the way to Syria is remarkably similar to the Bahira narrative, and this is what I mean by an extension, because literary tropes are being recycled by the Sirah producers. On the way to Syria, a Christian monk, who may have been a very aged Bahira or another monk, Martin Ling speculates that that monk's name was Nestor. Ultimately, we don't know, Allahu A'lam. A Christian monk sees the Prophet sitting and exclaims to Maysara, quote, no one but a prophet ever sat beneath this tree. On the road back to Mecca, a miracle occurs. To quote Ibn Ishaq, at the height of noon, when the heat was intense, as the apostle rode his beast, Maysara saw two angels shading the apostle from the sun's rays. So again, the aim of the trade narratives is to prove Muhammad's divine status as prophet. This also gives us new insight into the profitable outcome of the trip. The financial success of the trip is not so much a reflection of the Prophet's skill as a merchant, let alone evidence of the sacredness of business in Islam. Rather, it aligns with and represents the culmination of the signs and miracles during the whole journey, reflecting the blessing, the barakah, that only a true and genuine prophet brings. To conclude, the French philosopher Michel Foucault describes history writing as an act of the present. Rather than being a recovery of the past, historical narratives tell us more about the present time and the political, economic, and gendered systems that shape it. The modern representation of the prophet as entrepreneur is a powerful example of just how indebted contemporary Islam is to the logics and subjectivities of 21st century global capitalism. As the Sirah texts demonstrate, entrepreneurial Islam is anything but an authentic and faithful reflection of a prophetic sunnah embedded in late antiquity. It offers not a history of early Islam, but, to invoke Foucault, a history of the present, more specifically, a history of the Muslim present. Thank you.